Dr. James Cabrel. I'm a chemistry professor on campus. I have given a lot of these talks, I think a half dozen by now, and they have all been science and chemistry and pseudoscience related. But this is something that's much more personal to me, and I thought it would be interesting to sort of go through this myself and share it with you. So it's called Falcon's Flight, and I'll explain the significance of that in a little bit. And this is not just me telling my grandparents' story. It's sort of my story too, and how I've been able to process this information. And I don't think I could do this entire story justice in 45 minutes to an hour, particularly based on what I've researched. So if you have any questions about it after, please ask. So, in case you were wondering, that's me. At 9, I'm 9. So in 1988, I had no idea what Bermuda was. If you had asked me, I would have maybe said an animal. And because it's not a real populous or popular place to go. It's an island in the Atlantic off the coast of North Carolina. You usually only hear about it if there's a hurricane aiming right at them. So for my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary, they decided to take the entire family to Bermuda. Now, if you think about 50th wedding anniversaries, usually you're doing the party for them. So this was quite a bit unusual. It was my first time ever on a plane. Can't say I was too excited about that. I wasn't too excited about it a couple of days ago when I was flying back from California during all the turbulence. So a 9-year-old is not going to be interested in anything other than going to the beach. But we were invited into my grandparents' hotel room to hear a story. And I think some of the older people in the family, like my mother, knew a little bit of this. So to give you an idea, this is my grandfather and grandmother, Papa and Nanny to us. These are my parents. This is my Uncle John. My cousins Jen and Jack, my brother Steve, my Aunt Pat, and then my Aunt Linda. Curious fact about this picture, there used to be another person here. That was my aunt's boyfriend at the time, and after the fact, my uncle digitally replaced him with that palm tree. That palm tree was not there. So this is a famous picture in our family for that reason. So I was 9, as I said. My cousin and I decided that we were very bored, and we went into the next room to watch TV. And I believe we watched The Price is Right. So I regret that now that I am 40, as you will see. Whoop, forgot that doesn't work. All right, so what I want to play for you is a little bit of audio. My Uncle John recorded this. So this was originally on video cassettes. And I want to skip forward a little bit.
Grandmom and your great-grandmom was Leontine, for short Tina. That's where Susie got the middle name Susan Tina. And the family name was Lieberman, which later on, as you will hear later on, Grandpa became quite an important personality in Austria. Even a big building where embassies are located are named after him, still today. And my parents were a non-practicing Jewish family. They hadn't practiced, they hadn't gone to church or anything like that, because in Austria, even today, religion is very, very unimportant. Although the country is basically a Catholic country, about 90% Catholic, but religion does not take an important part in public life, but rather private, and nobody interferes with anybody else's private life. So you really don't know how many people go practice their religion or how many not. It doesn't enter, doesn't interfere in public relationship. That's still today that way. You can't really tell who's Catholic, who's Protestant, who's Jewish. That's their private affair. And this is the way I was brought up, and that's the way we all still feel. Anybody that, like Linda, likes to go and practice church, that's her business. People like we don't go to church, that's our business. That doesn't change our character. The real religion is what everybody, how good or how bad we are. If we are good people and try to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing, then that's a good religion, regardless in what kind of religion that would be.
So I hope you get an idea of who I am a little bit from that. I'll explain a little bit more about my grandfather's philosophy on life, hopefully a little bit later. But there was sort of in the middle of him describing his family. So my grandfather was born in 1915 in Vienna, Austria, as Alfred Ernst Lieberman. So you notice the change here, Lieberman to Linton. That happened later. As he said, Jewish, non-practicing. He became a member of what is called the Rote Falken. And this is the Red Falcons are an international social democratic group that support children's causes. And in many European countries at the time, in the early part of the 20th century, there were groups like this that were basically like the Boy Scouts, although these particular groups were coeducational, male and female. So he self-described a natural-born leader. So when he became involved in any particular group, he would rise to be a leader. So think about scout leader right away. Now, one of the things that was happening at the time, and this is sort of pre-Nazi, pre-Hitler, was sort of the formation of the fascist groups, a lot of fascist groups in Europe. And they were taking over many places. So Germany was already in that, and Hitler was there, but not in his leadership yet. So the fascists were coming down hard on a lot of groups. And you typically hear a lot about Jews, other minorities, the gypsies, homosexuals. But basically anyone who did not agree with their political beliefs, they would attack, arrest, etc. So there was a hint that they were going to come after my grandfather's family, because my great-grandfather, do I have him in here? Yes. So I'll skip ahead for a second. So this is my great-grandfather, Norbert. He was also a leader in Austria. One of the things that he was involved in was a union for insurance employees. So he ran what is essentially a public insurance company. So one of the things that is sort of a contrast to what we have in the United States is a lot of what many people consider socialist countries, like Northern Europe, Western Europe. There are a lot more government programs. So if you think about our government programs, Medicaid, welfare programs, they are much larger and much better supported in those countries. So that is sort of antithetical to what the fascists want. So the fascists were coming after my grandfather and my family because of how high up in a lot of these areas my great-grandfather was. So I'll come back to that. So basically word came down to my grandfather's family, get out. So through contacts, he was sent to Belgium. He was already working for, I don't know if it was my great-grandfather's insurance company, but an insurance company. He went to work in an insurance company in Belgium and got involved in the Belgian equivalent of the Red Falcons. So the Falcons flight, the title of the talk, is from them being in that particular group. So the reason why he left, and I think originally when I thought about this when I was younger, well, it's because he was Jewish. No, it was not. It was political. It was not, had nothing to do with religion. So that's sort of an interesting part to this. This is my grandmother on the left. So she was born Laure Marie GISLAINE DEPRINCE in 1920 in Brussels, Catholic, and she also became a member of those group, and that's how they met. And I'll come back to this picture later. So it turns out that after my grandfather had left Austria, gone to Belgium, he not only learned French very quickly, but also became involved in the Falcon Rouge, the Red Falcons, and they met that way and started going out together after being a part of those same youth groups. So he was in his late teens, early 20s, and she was in mid-teens, so they're about 5 years difference. And a couple of more things about my great-grandfather. The Anschluss, and the only time you may have heard this word, unless you have taken history with World War II, is they mention this in The Sound of Music. So if you've seen The Sound of Music, the reason why the von Trapp family leaves Austria is the Anschluss was essentially the Nazi takeover of Austria from Germany. So that happened in Austria. My grandfather and some of the family was still in Vienna at the time. He was arrested and then imprisoned in the Dachau concentration camp. He was eventually able to escape, and the entire family got to the United States. He did eventually go back and return to being a huge part of the insurance and other things related to that in Austria. This is a plaque. He has an entire park named after him in Vienna. So, and he has a wiki. I mean, depending on who you are, what's more important to you, that he's got a park named after him or he has a wiki. But I was able to learn some things. I guess these days the wiki is more important. So the Red Falcons, I was describing this before, so very popular in Europe. They still exist. There was an attempt to make this movement in the United States early on in the 20th century, but as you are aware, the word socialism is, that the word itself has become weaponized these days. And you could argue that most of the time it's not properly used the way that we would refer to it properly politically. So they were together in Belgium, and at the time, in the mid-30s, a lot of things were happening. You know, if you think about what happened in World War II, France, most of France was taken over, a lot of Europe was taken over, and so the fascists were sort of moving out from Germany in every direction. It came to a point where Belgium was essentially deporting anyone who was not Belgian. And the only way that my grandfather could stay in Belgium, as you probably have heard a lot of cases with immigrants, is you marry a local. Well, fortunately, he was dating a local. And I was just listening to this part of the recording. So he had to speak to some people, and he had pretty high-level contacts. And someone told him, well, you have to marry your girlfriend now, or you will be deported within a week or two. So he had to make the decision then to say yes, and then he went home and told my grandmother, look, we got to get married. So he had to tell my grandmother and my great-grandmother, oh, we got to get married now. So I wouldn't say it's a marriage of convenience. At least they were dating at the time, but I don't think it was the first choice. But they did get married right away, and he was able to stay for a time after that. What eventually happened is that even that did not protect him from being deported. So he was sent away. An attempt was made to get him back to Austria, which was his place of birth. His travel was intercepted, and along with another group of people, they were captured and they were going to be sent to a French concentration camp. Now, at that point, not the entire country of France had been taken over by the Nazis, but that march was happening. So they were essentially on cattle cars going through the French countryside. They had very little food and water. As he described it, they were packed into these cattle cars like sardines. There was very little movement. There was no hygiene. There was illness. One night, they would sometimes take them off the train, make them sleep in a barn, or even out in the open. At this point, this one instance, they were in a barn. In the middle of the night, a young German soldier with some supporting fascist French soldiers came in and made them stand at attention. And the entire situation to my grandfather was ludicrous. And if you think about it, the entire situation would be ludicrous to you too. So he happened to smile. And then basically these soldiers were sort of parading up and down in front of all of these prisoners that were standing up in a barn in France, somewhere in France. And my grandfather laughed a little bit. So at that point, the German soldier stopped, walked up to him, and put a gun at his temple. He said, "Do you think this is funny?" And so my grandfather froze. And so this was, you know, one of the many moments in this story where it could have gone one way or the other. And if you think about a moment like that going one way or the other, I'm standing here, so you can imagine what happened. For some inexplicable reason, the German soldier decided to move on. But as kids, we always remarked, well, Papa never smiles. Well, eventually we learned that this was the reason. So after this, he learned, or he decided, never to smile unless he was alone or with family. But even with family, you know, he was always a very loving, wonderful person, but he never really smiled or laughed for this particular reason. So eventually they traveled through France and made it to Saint Cyprien. And I had to, let's see if I can blow this up. There we go. That's a little bit better. So when I was looking this up, it's amazing what you can find these days, but Saint Cyprien also has a wiki, not just for the area itself, the city itself, but the fact that it was a concentration camp in France. So originally it was designed, as you can see, it's on the border of Spain. When I looked at the map originally, I thought, I don't think France has an east-facing like area on the water. So I was originally confused on where it was. So as you can see, France and Belgium is up here. They had traveled a long way, all the way down there. So it was repurposed as a concentration camp. It was closed down for a while and then reopened, and was open through large parts of the Second World War. It was very loosely run. It wasn't like the concentration camps, and they often called it a working camp instead of a concentration camp. But it wasn't as severe as what you have probably heard and read about in history books in Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia that were, where a lot more of the deaths of the Jews occurred. Not that this was a great place by any means, but sometimes the soldiers would send the prisoners into town, and the nearest town was Perpignan, to get supplies and bring them back. That was one of the ways that they got supplies. They became friends. They figured out ways. They found people that were doctors and had other specialties, so they'd be able to deal with illness. They were able to take. Some of them had supplies that they had brought with them from Belgium. So they had tin cans. They had silverware. They were able to make do. But there were some sketches made from that camp during that time that my grandfather had. So eating old bones, if that's all you had, that's what you ate. And then, sitting on a barrel. So this was an unpleasant place, and there was the sense that more bad things would happen if they didn't escape. So there was a point where, I should say that my grandfather had made a good friend, and the name was Schmidt. There was a time where they were sending prisoners from this camp back to Belgium. And my grandmother at the time was having her own troubles trying to get out of Belgium to meet up with him somewhere in France. So they had, I believe it was a safe, or a place where they kept all their documents and money. She had no key. My grandfather had taken the only key with him. And he still had it. So many of these men had not been stripped of all their things. They still had them. So all the men were lined up. Some of them were chosen to go back to Belgium. Schmidt was chosen. So he was able to take the key and other materials to go back to Belgium and let my grandmother know that, one, my grandfather was alive, and she was able to get the key and into the apartment and get their materials. At the time, she was trying to get out, but because of how things were in Europe at the time, She eventually, had to say, oh, this is my husband, he's Jewish. That became much more of a problem for her. She was Catholic, but she was married to a Jew. As you can imagine, that was a particular problem. She would be going to offices every day to try to get information, to try to get a visa or pass or something like that. So she had her own run-in with fascist soldiers in Belgium. She was working, she was trying to make friends, she was a very friendly person, and so she was speaking to some, I don't know if they were German soldiers, but they were fascist soldiers. And they were talking about various members of the Nazi Party, and Hermann Goering was mentioned. And she, as she said, I only really knew one insult in German, and was Schweinehund, which, if you translate it, means pig dog. And the soldier stopped and looked at her and said, if you weren't such a pretty girl, I would arrest you or shoot you. So, as you can imagine, not talking about in a particular way or smiling is sort of a result of a lot of these things. So, yeah. She eventually was able to get out, as was he. So, getting back to this story, he and a group of other people, other prisoners, were sent to the town to pick up supplies. And the guy that he was with apparently had contacts. So whatever that means. And they were able to get to a bakery. And some sympathetic people were at this bakery, and they said, instead of going back to the camp, you can hide behind our oven. And then after everyone has left, you can escape. So they had to, for hours, were cramped behind a intensely hot oven, because that was a safe place. No one would look back there. And that is how he escaped this camp, by going to town, being behind a hot bakery oven for hours. And I forget exactly how many hours. They were able to get a little bit of water, but it was, he's saying, the only reason I could stand being in that intense heat is knowing that I would be able to escape eventually, which they did. So one of the things about the story was, I think that man said that he was, I forget the name that he used, but my grandfather was told by him that he was the nephew of Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice. So I have not been able to independently verify that with research. The fact that Louis Brandeis had a nephew that was eventually lost in Europe around World War II, but that's what the story was. So it's interesting to go back and hear about, oh yeah, I talked with this prime minister, which was something that was earlier on in the story about talking to the prime minister of Belgium at the time. It's like, how were you able to leverage all of your contacts into talking to the prime minister of Belgium at the time? And these stories that I heard, that originally heard back in the late 80s, and then I've been listening to the recordings too, it's like, I wish I could verify these things, but, at this point, a lot of this is it's just, it's essentially an oral history now. So they met up in France. My grandparents met back up in France, and it was still a time where they could have been arrested at any moment. So they still had to find sympathetic people. They still had to find restaurants and cafes where they could try to get money. Finding money at this point was a very tricky thing. So they eventually made their way to Morocco. So the idea was to get out of Europe some way and get to the United States. So at this point, some members of the family had already come over here. So there was at least that. There was no way to get money back over, but they were able to communicate some with the family members that were already here. So the goal was eventually to get here, obviously. So they eventually found their way to Casablanca. And in the process, they met other people. They were able to forge new friendships. They were able to get medical attention. They were able to help people. But they were on essentially two different ships trying to get out of Morocco. So one of them was the Montviseau, and the other was the Serpe Pinto. and sort of these came into play with the stories. You know, they were stuck there in Morocco for a significant period of time because there was a blockade. The ships were not allowed to leave. So sometime there was one part of the story where they left the harbor, but then were forced back. They thought they were going to leave, and they were forced back. They were let off the ships to get supplies and speak to people in town. They made more contacts. They made more friends. Now, one of the things that I was able to find, and I don't know if yes, I did do a picture. So the Serpa Pinto was a ship, a Portuguese ship, and it had other lifetimes and did other things before World War II. But a lot of people made their way from Europe during World War II through Morocco and other ports along West Africa eventually to the United States. So a lot of people were leaving Nazi-controlled Europe at the time, and you can find a lot of stories. Some prominent Jewish leaders at the time in the sort of the more Orthodox and even Hasidic communities left Europe at the time and came on the Serpa Pinto. So there's a very interesting part of that. So my grandfather acquired a camera, so he was taking pictures of a lot of things, and I wish I could do justice to all the pictures that he took. This is a picture of my grandmother on the Mont Viso at the time. They were able to go into Casablanca, so there was pictures of people in Casablanca, and maybe I can show some of those later. But my grandfather was always a photographer after that. If you don't know about photography, Leicas are very, very good cameras. And that company still makes very, very high-end cameras. So I don't remember. Someone in the family, I believe, has that camera or some of the cameras that he had after that fact. I'm not sure who. So there was there was a dozen interesting stories about what was happening to them at this time. If I go back to this picture, so this is Susie, who I knew as Susie Freed, and they met on one of those ships. And Susie came over and eventually married an American, and they maintained their friendship. And we came to know the Freeds as Uncle Steve and Aunt Susie, Susie and Steve Freed. So we would visit them regularly. They had a house in the Catskills, and they were basically part of the family for us. They also had an apartment in New York City that we visited a couple of times, and even until Susie Freed died, I think she died before my son was born, so 2011. So that was a long time that she meeting on a ship on the way from Europe to be essentially a part of our family. So that was another sort of amazing aspect of this. Oh, the picture's right there, of course. So yeah, they made lots of new friends, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. There was a story that, oh gosh, I think my grandfather had to have a tooth pulled. And I'm not sure if it was this doctor or another doctor, but having had surgery in Morocco without proper hospitalization, there was something about having to tie the blood vessels off by hand. Like, it's just, again, I'm not a storyteller, so I can't do all of this justice, but there were just all sorts of these little stories that, having surgery without the proper equipment in the middle of a foreign country, essentially in the desert, that could have gone any way too, if you think about that. So they eventually were let out. The blockade was lifted, or the ship was able to leave, and they made their way to Bermuda. Now, one of the other things that my grandfather had sort of taken pictures of were the blockade ships. So, Nazi installments, Nazi ships, and he had those pictures with him. And if you think about it, he was essentially acting as a spy. And when they came into Bermuda, he shared that information with the local authorities. So I mean, he wasn't intentionally acting as a spy, I don't think, but he was able to leverage those pictures as a way of sort of proving loyalty. You know, we are not spies, we are not Nazis. We're on your side. We want to escape. We want to get to the Western Hemisphere. Some of the times when I've been researching this and thinking about how my family went to Bermuda for this first time and how they came to Bermuda, you know, again, this is the reason why we went to Bermuda in the first place, because it was the first time they had met people and felt safe in the Western Hemisphere. They felt like they had finally escaped. It was still a long time before they eventually got to America, but this is sort of the first time when they were in Hamilton Harbor that they felt like they had escaped. I mean, my grandfather in the recording basically said it was hell. So we had to go through hell in order to get out of Europe at the time. Eventually, they had to go through a lot of security protocols, and most people did. You know, again, it's making sure that there are not spies and other things coming across from Nazi-controlled Europe. They eventually made their way to Cuba, and this was, you know, when we think of Cuba, we think of Fidel Castro and communism, but this was before that, so it was a very different kind of country at that time. They still did not have a way to get into the United States. They were still communicating with family. They were able, once they were in Cuba, able to get money, still not enough to get what they needed to get into the United States. So my grandfather used his camera and set up a photography business, again, forming friends, making a business partnership. So they were able eventually to have enough money to get into the United States and join the rest of the family. So it was important after they left Europe to change their name. They wanted to be Americans. So I was debating how political to sort of make this talk, but we still have a lot of people that are trying to get into the United States for a better life. You know, right now we're dealing with it at our southern border. And you know, you can discuss the merits and discuss the issues related to that as much as you'd like, but the way that I think about people wanting to come into this country to escape hell, you know, what are you going to put yourself through in order to get out of hell? And these days, you can think about what is happening in a lot of Latin American countries, Central American countries. How is that so different than what my grandparents escaped? Yes, Nazis and the Second World War and all of that, and it's a very horrible thing to think about, but when you're trying to escape criminals and gangs and murder, it's on a smaller scale, but it's life or death. So I'm lucky that my grandparents made it. A lot of people don't. And then we are setting up, you know, we have this huge discussion these days about our southern border and letting people come into the country. So I have my own particular beliefs about that, and it comes from this. But they wanted to be Americans, so they changed their name from Lieberman to Linton. They, at this point, didn't really speak English much. And my grandfather decided to go into the Army. You know, what better way to show that you're American than go into the Army? And you know, from what had happened with the pictures that he had taken over in Morocco, that was part of his story, and it went with him. Where's the picture? So the picture of this is when he was in the Army. Now, he was not in long. The travel had greatly reduced his health. He had a bad back. As you can imagine, all the things that he had to deal with left him pretty frail. And my grandfather was not a tall person, you know. I'm not exactly sure how high, but 5'4", 5'5", and thin. You know, so not the kind of guy you would expect to see going into the Army. Andrew, I'm not sure how many guys you saw that were, you know, yay tall and 100 pounds. Probably some, but so he was not in long. There were also some issues with the family, you know, and something else that sort of, you know, happens, and I think it's less so now in the armed forces. You get hardship leaves if the male head of the family was killed or was incapacitated in some way. The younger males of the family were allowed discharges to go take over the family household. I don't think it's exactly the same these days. But as you can see, they started a family. So my mother and my aunt and my uncle, they had a house, a car. My grandfather became a salesman, aluminum. So aluminum siding and aluminum products. A lot of bouncing back and forth between companies, but his natural leadership qualities made him a good salesman, and he made him a good leader in business as well. So he was able to provide for the family over time. It still wasn't very easy, but you know, if you think about the stereotype of the American dream, they were living they created the American dream for themselves. Business and money and family and all those things, and this is sort of what has come out of it. My grandfather and grandmother always wanted to make sure the family was safe and happy. So one of the things that they did, they always gave, and they were always, you know, one of the terms that you could use is progressive. So it's always about giving the community. They would go back to Vienna to take care of. So my grandfather had gotten remarried, so they would travel back to Europe and help take care of my step-great-grandmother. But they were always giving and open, which was always a wonderful thing for us. Some family from Europe came over to visit. So again, that's me. I don't know exactly how old I am. I might be 3. The outfits from the early 80s, my goodness. But that's my grandmother and her brother Jacques, and Jacques' wife. So they came to visit. I don't think I ever met, even as a baby, any of my great-grandparents. So my great-grandfather Norbert, who you've seen in this talk, died, you know, I think in the late 50s. So I never got to meet any of those people. But some of the other family members I met. I have not yet been to Europe, although I would like to go someday. So even though my grandfather was only in the Army for a little bit of time, he was still considered a veteran. And this was one of those things that we learned about as kids. We learned about from this conversation, but it didn't really click, particularly with me. I didn't, you know. Sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. If you think about older family members for you who, you know, older family members who have been in World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, there is sort of, I don't know, a gravity about having someone as a veteran in your family like that. It's a source of pride, and for good reason. You know, I can't say that my grandfather did very much. I think he mostly traveled around between different camps and bases at the time and didn't really get to do anything. But even so, he went into the service. So eventually, and my aunt and uncle had to do a lot of maneuvering to get this to happen, but eventually he was interred at the Washington Crossing National Cemetery in Pennsylvania. So I got to see a full service with gun salute and the flag and everything. And my mother has the flag right now, and it's still sad for me to think about going to that service, but it's such a profound ceremony to see, you know, the stateliness of it. And after so he passed away in 2001. My grandmother passed away in 2014. So they are interred together here. So it's interesting, and it's hard to see in this picture because I didn't do a good job taking it, but you have the cross here and the Star of David here, even though for a long period of time they were not practicing, but it was a choice to include those, and then at the bottom, proud and grateful Americans. And that was always something that sort of was a part of the family, that they were proud and grateful Americans after everything that they'd gone through and found safety and protection in the United States. And I am a proud and grateful American too. And when I think about them coming into the country, what they had to do, and what people, as I said before, coming into the country now, it would be interesting to ask those people who come in, are you a proud and grateful American? I would just, you know, it would be interesting for me to sort of hear that from those people, to see, I don't know. I'm sort of losing my train of thought as I'm thinking about this. Like I was listening to some of this, my grandfather talk just before coming here, and it's every time I think about that and listen to that voice, like I heard that voice growing up, and it's still difficult to listen to emotionally. The other thing about that is my dad passed away 7 years ago now, and his voice is recorded, you know, and I don't have any other recordings. I have a lot of memories, some videos a little bit, but you know, to hear that voice, like it's a very visceral, emotional experience to hear a loved one's voice after they've passed away. You know, you've probably seen videos of family members who have passed away and how emotional that can feel. And then you tie that up with such an important set of experiences. It's just, yeah. So let me see if I can, there's a couple other pictures that I wanted to show that I sort of didn't put in. So one of them is this one. So my mother had a chance to go to Europe this past summer, and it was one of those river cruises in Europe on the Danube, I think. And so she was able to take a taxi, get off the tour, and able to visit that park. So it was a very special moment that she was able to have. Let's see other pictures. This is their wedding photo. It still makes me wonder what was going through their heads at that time. Of we get married on the fly. Let's hope it works out. You know, it's amazing to me. More pictures from the time when they were on the ships. And then these were some of the pictures that my grandfather took in Morocco. Moroccan people there, the public fountain. So, you know, the fact that I'm a photographer, and I think one of the reasons why is for this. I want to sort of do a counterpoint. This is my mother's family, so this is a major part, you know, of my mother's family. I learned a couple of things. One, my great-grandfather was born in Ukraine. And growing up, I had always thought I had three sources of my ancestry. Belgium for my grandmother, Austria for my grandfather, and then on my dad's side is the Czech Republic. So Gabriel is a Slavic or Czech name. In the Czech Republic, it would be Kaberhel. So not sure why they pronounce it this way. And how many of you, when you came in, looked at my name and were like, how do I pronounce that? This is why I go by Dr. K, because I don't make you guys pronounce it. So I now, you know, and the reason why I know this, I think it was discussed with my family recently, but the wiki page for my great-grandfather says he was born in the Ukraine, so now I have Ukrainian ancestry. So the four siblings, So my grandfather, Alfred, was the third. So my Aunt Olga was the oldest. She lived to 103. My great Aunt Erna, I don't have as much information about her. I've met her in Florida, but I think she lived at least until her early 90s. My grandfather died in 2001. He was 86. And the youngest, Otto, who happened to be arrested in Austria around the time that my grandfather escaped, lived to be 100. He died this past year. So there's some good longevity in my family. When I think about this and when I talk about this, it makes me a little sad that I don't have this kind of information, ancestral information, from my dad's side. My grandparents on my dad's side were born in the United States. Their parents were from the Czech Republic. I remember being taught some Czech words and Czech phrases when I was younger, but I don't have this kind of ancestral information, any kind of ancestral information, other than the Czech Republic from my dad's side. So it comes with a little bit of guilt because I never asked. You know, I was fortunate enough that my grandparents volunteered this information and shared it with us. But sometimes I wish I could go back 20 years, 25 years, you know, with one of those like student projects, you know, when you're in elementary school or in middle school, where you have to go interview a grandparent. I never really did that, not that I can recall. And I wish I had done that to find out more about my dad's side of the family. I mean, at this point, there's not very many people left in my dad's family because my dad's passed away, my grandparents have passed away. I've got an aunt somewhere, but she's estranged from the family, so it's essentially me and my brother. You know, but we just don't know a lot of information. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do is find out about your family. You know, it's a lot of that information can be lost if it doesn't get shared. You know, and it doesn't have to be something like this, you know, where it's a profound story. It's funny, the 50s, the style of the 50s, you know, but find out about your family. You never know what kind of interesting stories you're going to hear. Find out, but I would, you know, it's a bit sad to say, but find out before it's too late. So I've been a bit more rambly with this one because it was sort of hard to remember everything related to the story, and I hope that if any of my family members watch this and listen to this, that I hope I got it all right. I'm not sure if I did. But thank you for coming and listening to this, and if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask.